Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in Stone County, Missouri. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The winter of 1934 descended upon the Ozark Mountains of Stone County, Missouri with unusual harshness. Snow accumulated in drifts that blocked the narrow gravel roads connecting isolated homesteads to the county seat of Galena. It was during this period of enforced isolation that events unfolded at what locals called the Sanctuary of Eternal Peace, a wooden structure situated along Mill Creek Road, approximately 14 miles southeast of Galena. The church was established in late 1932 by a man calling himself Pastor Silas Blackthornne, though county records would later reveal this was not his birth name. Blackthornne had arrived in Stone County from unknown origins, carrying only a worn leather valise and claiming divine instructions to establish a new congregation in the Missouri Hills. He was described by contemporary witnesses as a tall, angular man in his mid-40s, with piercing dark eyes and prematurely silver hair swept back from a prominent forehead. His voice, according to those who heard him preach, possessed an unusual resonance that seemed to penetrate deep into the consciousness of his listeners. The church itself was constructed on land purchased from Cornelius Whitmore, a widowed farmer who owned considerable acreage along Mill Creek. According to the deed filed at the Stone County Courthouse on December 3, 1932, Blackthornne paid Whitmore the full asking price of $500 in cash, an extraordinary transaction during a period when most local business was conducted through barter or extended credit arrangements. The building that rose on the property was austere by conventional standards, a simple rectangular structure measuring approximately 40 by 60 feet, with plain glass windows and a steep-pitched roof designed to shed the heavy snows common to the region. What distinguished the Sanctuary of Eternal Peace from other rural congregations was not its architecture, but its rapidly growing membership and the increasingly secretive nature of its activities. Within 8 months of its establishment, the congregation had grown from Blackthornne and a handful of curious locals to more than 60 regular attendees, drawn primarily from the scattered homesteads throughout southeastern Stone County and neighboring areas of Christian and Tanay counties. Among the early converts was Ezekiel Mordaunt, a struggling tobacco farmer in his 30s who had recently lost his wife to consumption. Mordaunt had been working his hillside property alone since her death, finding it increasingly difficult to maintain both his crops and his emotional equilibrium. When Pastor Blackthornne approached him during a particularly difficult period in early 1933, offering both spiritual guidance and practical assistance with his agricultural problems, Mordaunt found the pastor's message compelling. A letter preserved in the collection of the Missouri State Historical Society, written by Mordaunt to his brother-in-law in Kansas City in May 1933, provides insight into the initial appeal of Blackthorne's ministry. The letter, discovered during the estate settlement following Mordaunt's later disappearance, reads in part, "Dear Franklin, I must tell you of the remarkable preacher who has come to our area. Pastor Blackthorne speaks with such authority about the Scriptures, revealing interpretations I had never before considered. He says that God intends His faithful servants to prosper in this life, not merely endure suffering until death. I have begun attending His gatherings, and already I have seen improvements in my circumstances. The tobacco crop is thriving despite the poor soil, and the pastor has helped me find new buyers in Springfield who pay considerably better prices than what I received locally." Spine. Similar testimonials from the period suggest that Blackthorne's initial success stemmed from his ability to combine religious enthusiasm with practical business guidance. He helped farmers find new markets for their products, negotiated better terms with creditors, and provided small loans to individuals facing immediate financial hardship. These tangible benefits, combined with his charismatic preaching style, created a devoted following that grew steadily throughout 1933. However, according to depositions taken during a federal investigation conducted in 1936, Blackthorne's methods became increasingly concerning as his influence expanded. Nehemiah Blackwood, a neighboring farmer who briefly attended services at the sanctuary, later testified that the preacher gradually introduced teachings that departed significantly from conventional Christian doctrine. Blackwood's statement, filed with the Federal Bureau of Investigation on April 18, 1936, describes meetings that evolved from traditional prayer services into sessions where members were encouraged to confess their personal failures publicly and surrender their individual will to the collective guidance of the congregation. Another early member who would later provide crucial testimony was Matthias Thornfield, a 42-year-old widower who operated a small sawmill near the White River. Thornfield had joined Blackthorne's congregation in March 1933, attracted by the pastor's promises of economic prosperity and spiritual fulfillment. In his later FBI deposition, Thornfield described the gradual transformation he witnessed in both the congregation and in himself. At first, Pastor Blackthorne seemed like a godsend. My sawmill was failing, I owed money to creditors in 3 counties, and I was drinking heavily to cope with the loss of my wife. The pastor not only helped me find new contracts for lumber, but he also provided what seemed like genuine spiritual counsel that helped me overcome my drinking problem. Thornfield's testimony reveals how Blackthorne systematically identified and exploited the vulnerabilities of potential followers. The pastor appeared to have an uncanny ability to discern exactly what each individual needed most desperately, whether it was financial assistance, emotional support, or spiritual guidance. Once he had established this initial connection, he gradually began to reshape his followers' entire worldview. The transition appears to have occurred gradually throughout 1933. Church attendance records maintained in Blackthorne's precise handwriting and discovered after the fact show that regular members were expected to attend not only Sunday services, but also weekday meetings held in the basement of the church building. These additional gatherings were described as purification sessions, where members would fast for extended periods while engaging in intensive prayer and mutual confession. Dr. Obadiah Whitfield, a physician who served Stone County from his practice in Galena, treated several church members during this period for what he described as symptoms consistent with chronic malnutrition and physical exhaustion. In his medical journal, preserved in the archives of the Missouri Medical Association, Dr. Whitfield noted, "I have observed a concerning pattern among adherents of the Mill Creek congregation, patients present with significant weight loss, pallid complexion, and signs of chronic fatigue. When questioned about their diet, they speak of spiritual discipline recommended by their pastor. Several have collapsed during farm work, lacking the physical strength for manual labor. I have attempted to counsel them about proper nutrition, but they insist their condition is a temporary sacrifice required for spiritual purification." Dr. Whitfield's records also document his growing concern about what appeared to be systematic psychological manipulation within the congregation. In a detailed case study he prepared for the Missouri Medical Association in 1935, Dr. Whitfield wrote, "The patients from the Mill Creek Church exhibit a constellation of symptoms that I have not previously encountered in my medical practice. While they present with obvious signs of malnutrition, their psychological presentation is perhaps more troubling. Many seem to have lost the ability to make independent decisions about even basic aspects of their daily lives. They frequently defer to the authority of designated church leaders for guidance on matters ranging from what to eat to when to sleep." The isolation imposed by the harsh winter of 1934 appears to have accelerated whatever psychological processes Blackthorne had set in motion within his congregation. Mail delivery to the remote areas of Stone County was sporadic under the best of circumstances, and the heavy snows of that winter made communication with the outside world even more difficult. It was during this period that neighbors began to notice changes in the behavior of church members that went beyond mere religious devotion. Zebulon Crawford, who operated a general store at the crossroads near Mill Creek, later told investigators that members of Blackthorne's congregation stopped making their regular trips to purchase supplies. When they did appear, they seemed listless and spoke in whispers, purchasing only small quantities of basic necessities. Most disturbing, according to Crawford's testimony, was their apparent inability to conduct normal business transactions. Several members would stand silently at his counter, seemingly unable to remember what they had come to buy, until another church member would speak for them. Crawford's observations were corroborated by Lemuel Ashcroft, the local postmaster who had served the rural Stone County community for more than 15 years. In his deposition to federal investigators, Ashcroft described a noticeable change in the mail patterns of congregation members. Starting around November 1933, I noticed that folks connected with that church stopped receiving and sending letters like they used to. These were people who had regularly corresponded with family members in other states, but suddenly their mail just dried up. When I asked about it, they would just say they were focusing on more important matters but couldn't explain what they meant. Or, the first official indication that something was seriously wrong came in February 1934, when Mordaunt's brother-in-law, Franklin, arrived from Kansas City, concerned about the lack of correspondence from his usually reliable correspondent. According to his statement to the Stone County Sheriff's Office, Franklin found Mordaunt's homestead in a state of severe neglect. The livestock appeared underfed, the house was inadequately heated despite abundant firewood on the property, and Mordaunt himself seemed unable to engage in coherent conversation. Franklin's written statement, filed on February 15, 1934, describes his visit in disturbing detail. I found Ezekiel sitting by a cold fireplace, wearing clothes that appeared not to have been changed in weeks. He had lost considerable weight and spoke only of the need to surrender all worldly attachments. When I asked about his crops and livestock, he said they were distractions from the divine purpose, but could not or would not explain what this purpose might be. I offered to help him restart his fire and prepare a meal, but he insisted that such physical comforts were obstacles to spiritual advancement. The condition of his property was shocking. Farm equipment lay scattered and rusting, fences were broken, and there was no evidence of recent agricultural activity. I begged him to come with me to Kansas City for medical evaluation, but he became agitated and said leaving would interfere with God's plan for his purification. Franklin's efforts to involve local authorities were initially unsuccessful. Sheriff Augustus Grimm, a part-time law enforcement officer who served Stone County while maintaining his own livestock operation, was reluctant to interfere in what appeared to be religious matters. His report, filed with the state authorities after the subsequent investigation, reveals the difficulties faced by rural law enforcement in addressing unusual situations. Mr. Franklin Kessler came to my office expressing concern about his brother-in-law's welfare. I explained that unless actual crimes were being committed, I had no authority to intervene in religious activities. Mr. Kessler insisted something was wrong at the Mill Creek Church, but when I asked for specific allegations of criminal behavior, he could only describe what seemed to be extreme religious devotion rather than violations of law. Sheriff Grimm's reluctance to intervene was not unusual for the period. Rural law enforcement in the 1930s was severely understaffed and underfunded, with most sheriffs serving large geographic areas with minimal resources. Additionally, the constitutional protection of religious freedom made authorities hesitant to investigate religious communities, even when there were signs of potential problems. The breakthrough came in early March 1934, when Dr. Whitfield was called to treat a church member who had collapsed while attempting to walk to Galena. The patient, identified as Jeremiah Ashford, a 38-year-old bachelor who had joined Blackthorne's congregation in mid-1933, was found unconscious along the road by a traveling merchant. Dr. Whitfield's examination revealed severe malnutrition and what he described as signs of prolonged psychological distress. More significantly, during periods of consciousness, Ashford made statements that prompted Dr. Whitfield to contact state authorities. According to the physician's report, Ashford repeatedly claimed that Pastor Blackthorne was collecting souls in vessels and that church members who questioned his teachings were being disciplined in the underground chambers. When pressed for details, Ashford became extremely agitated and begged Dr. Whitfield not to reveal what he had said, claiming that Blackthorne would know of any betrayal and exact terrible punishment. Dr. Whitfield's report to the Missouri State Police, dated March 12, 1934, marked the beginning of formal investigation into the Sanctuary of Eternal Peace. The report reads in part, "Patient exhibits signs of severe malnutrition and psychological disturbance consistent with prolonged isolation and possible psychological manipulation. His statements suggest activities at the Mill Creek Church that may constitute fraud or criminal coercion. I recommend immediate investigation by appropriate authorities, as I believe other members of this congregation may be in similar physical and mental condition." The investigation that followed would reveal one of the most systematic cases of psychological manipulation and financial fraud in Missouri history. Detective Lieutenant Barnabas Morrison, assigned to the case by the state police, began his inquiry with a thorough review of county records related to Pastor Blackthorne and his congregation. What he discovered raised immediate concerns about the preacher's background and methods. According to Detective Morrison's report, filed on March 20, 1934, no records existed for a Silas Blackthorne prior to his appearance in Stone County. The previous address he had provided when purchasing the church property proved to be fictitious, and attempts to trace his earlier activities led to dead ends. More troubling, financial records showed that while Blackthorne had initially paid cash for the church property, subsequent transactions suggested he had gained control over significant assets belonging to his congregation members. Property transfer records revealed that between February and November 1933, at least 9 individuals had deeded their farms and personal property to the Sanctuary of Eternal Peace, with Blackthorne listed as the sole legal representative. These transfers, while technically legal, represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in assets being concentrated under the control of a single individual whose background could not be verified. Detective Morrison's investigation also uncovered evidence of Blackthorne's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and group dynamics. Among the documents found in the church office was a collection of what appeared to be psychological profiles of congregation members written in Blackthorne's careful handwriting. These profiles detailed each individual's personal history, family relationships, financial situation, and what Blackthorne termed their points of leverage, the specific fears, desires, or vulnerabilities that could be exploited to maintain control over them. One such profile written about Matthias Thornfield read, "Subject exhibits classic signs of unresolved grief following spouse's death. Financial pressures and alcohol dependency create additional leverage points. Responds well to combination of practical assistance and spiritual guidance, but shows independence tendencies that must be systematically undermined. Recommend gradual isolation from external support systems and increased dependency on church community for all decision-making." Yuhata. The investigation gained urgency when Morrison attempted to visit the church property and was denied access by guards posted at the entrance to the building. These guards, identified as members of the congregation, claimed that the church was engaged in a 50-day purification retreat that could not be interrupted by outsiders. When Morrison insisted on speaking with Pastor Blackthornne, he was told that the pastor was in deep communion with the divine and would not emerge until the retreat was completed. Morrison's report describes the scene he encountered. The church building appears to be occupied by a substantial number of individuals, as evidenced by smoke from multiple fires and the presence of temporary shelters erected around the main structure. However, no congregation members were visible during daylight hours, and the guards maintained that all spiritual activities were conducted after dark. The guards themselves appeared undernourished and spoke in an unusual manner, often pausing mid-sentence as if receiving some form of internal guidance before continuing their responses. Unable to gain access to the church property through conventional means, Morrison established surveillance positions in the surrounding hills and began documenting the activities he could observe from a distance. His surveillance log, maintained for 3 weeks in March 1934, records increasingly disturbing observations. The entries describe nighttime activities around the church building, including fires that burned throughout the night and what appeared to be group gatherings in an area behind the main structure. Most concerning were Morrison's observations of what he described as disciplinary proceedings conducted in full view of the congregation. While distance prevented him from discerning specific details, his notes describe scenes of members being forced to remain motionless for hours, while others stood in formation around them. Morrison's surveillance also revealed the presence of what appeared to be a significant excavation project behind the church building. His notes from March 25, 1934 describe, "Large quantities of soil have been removed from an area approximately 30 feet square behind the main structure. Work appears to be conducted exclusively during nighttime hours, with congregation members forming lines to remove containers of earth. Purpose of excavation unknown, but depth appears considerable based on time required for containers to emerge from the excavation site." The detective also noted the arrival and departure of visitors to the church property, including individuals who appeared to be delivering supplies under cover of darkness. These visitors were always met by the same group of guards and never remained on the property for more than a few minutes. Morrison's attempts to follow these visitors were unsuccessful due to their apparent familiarity with local roads and their ability to quickly disappear into the network of rural routes that crisscrossed the county. The situation reached a crisis point on March 28, 1934, when a resident of a neighboring farm reported seeing what appeared to be a human body being carried from the church building during the early morning hours. This report, combined with Morrison's surveillance observations and Dr. Whitfield's medical evidence, provided sufficient justification for a formal raid on the church property. The raid, conducted on March 30, 1934, involved Detective Morrison, Sheriff Grimm, 3 additional state police officers, and Dr. Whitfield. What they found inside the Sanctuary of Eternal Peace would shock even experienced law enforcement officers and ultimately attract national attention to the case. The main sanctuary of the church appeared to have been modified for residential occupancy, with sleeping areas separated by hanging canvas sheets and personal belongings organized in neat arrangements throughout the space. However, it was the condition of the congregation members that most alarmed the investigating officers. More than 40 adults, all appearing to be in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, were found in various states of malnutrition and psychological distress. Detective Morrison's official report describes the scene. Congregation members appeared to be in a collective state of psychological confusion. When questioned about their welfare, most were unable to provide coherent responses. Several individuals remained seated motionless for extended periods, only moving when specifically directed by designated leaders. The overall atmosphere was one of profound silence, broken only by whispered communications that appeared to require approval from authorized representatives before being spoken aloud. Dr. Whitfield's medical examination of the congregation members revealed a systematic pattern of physical and psychological deterioration. his report notes. The individuals examined show clear signs of chronic malnutrition, including muscle wasting, vitamin deficiencies, and compromised immune function. More concerning, however, are the psychological symptoms. Many subjects appear to have lost basic decision-making capabilities and exhibit extreme dependency on authority figures for even simple choices. This pattern is consistent with prolonged psychological manipulation and systematic breaking down of individual autonomy. More disturbing was the discovery of the church's basement, which had been excavated far beyond what the building's original foundation would have required. Dr. Whitfield's report notes that the basement space extended at least 30 feet underground and contained a series of small chambers separated by rough wooden partitions. In several of these chambers, investigators found evidence of prolonged human occupancy, including soiled bedding and primitive sanitary facilities. The basement chambers varied in size and apparent purpose. Some were barely large enough for a single person to lie down, while others could accommodate several individuals. The walls of these chambers bore what appeared to be scratch marks, suggesting desperate attempts by occupants to escape or mark the passage of time. In one chamber, investigators found a crude calendar scratched into the wall, with marks indicating a period of confinement lasting at least 2 months. The excavation behind the church building proved to be connected to the basement through a tunnel system that appeared to have been hand-dug over a period of months. This underground complex contained additional chambers, some of which showed evidence of recent use, including personal items belonging to congregation members and crude furniture constructed from scavenged materials. Most disturbing was the discovery in the deepest chamber of what Morrison described as a systematic collection of personal items belonging to congregation members, organized with methodical precision. These items included jewelry, family photographs, letters, and other personal effects that members had presumably surrendered to the church. They were arranged in labeled containers, with each member's possessions kept separate and cataloged in Blackthorne's meticulous handwriting. Among these personal effects, investigators found items that told the story of the lives that had been systematically dismantled by Blackthorne's manipulation. Wedding rings, family Bibles, children's toys, and photographs of loved ones had all been stripped away from their owners and stored like trophies. Each container was labeled not only with the owner's name, but also with the date the items had been surrendered, and what appeared to be a psychological assessment of the individual's spiritual progress. Windos, the investigation took a darker turn when several congregation members were found to be missing from the property, including Ezekiel Mordaunt and at least 6 other individuals who had been regular attendees at church services. When questioned about these absences, other members provided contradictory explanations, with some claiming the missing individuals had achieved spiritual transcendence, while others insisted they were serving in other locations without being able to specify where these locations might be. Pastor Blackthorne himself was found in the deepest chamber of the underground complex, seated at a crude desk where he appeared to have been writing in a series of ledgers. His behavior during arrest was described by Detective Morrison as unnaturally calm, as if he had been anticipating our arrival. Blackthorne spoke little during his initial detention, responding to questions with biblical quotations and references to divine judgment. The ledgers found in Blackthorne's possession would prove to be crucial evidence in understanding the scope of his operations. Written in the same precise script found on the property records, these documents detailed not only the financial assets he had accumulated from his congregation, but also what appeared to be psychological profiles of individual members, noting their particular vulnerabilities and the methods most effective for maintaining their compliance. One entry, dated February 20th, 1934, provides insight into Blackthorne's methods. E. Mordaunt continues to show attachment to worldly concerns regarding his deceased wife's memory. His grief creates resistance to complete surrender of individual will. Recommend extended isolation period with restricted nutritional intake to encourage proper focus on eternal rather than temporal attachments. His property deed transfer has been completed, removing his final connection to material independence. Similar entries document Blackthorne's systematic approach to psychological manipulation of his followers. He appears to have carefully studied each individual's background, personal losses, and emotional vulnerabilities, then crafted specific strategies for undermining their independence and critical thinking abilities. The ledgers reveal a methodical process of isolating members from outside influences, creating dependency through controlled access to food and shelter, and gradually replacing their personal identity with complete devotion to his authority. The search for the missing congregation members led to one of the most disturbing discoveries in the case. Following information provided by members who had been detained at the church, investigators located a secondary site approximately 4 miles from the main church building, accessible only through a nearly invisible trail that wound through dense forest on property that Blackthorne had recently acquired. At this location, hidden in a natural depression surrounded by thick vegetation, investigators found what could only be described as a primitive detention facility. Several small structures had been constructed using salvaged materials, and the area showed evidence of recent habitation. However, it was the condition of the individuals found at this site that provided the most shocking evidence of Blackthorne's methods. The missing congregation members, including Mordaunt, were discovered in a state that Dr. Whitfield later described as severe psychological and physical deterioration. They had been confined in structures barely large enough for a single person to lie down, with minimal food and water provided at irregular intervals. According to medical examinations conducted after their rescue, several individuals showed signs of systematic nutritional deprivation that suggested a deliberate program designed to weaken physical resistance and cognitive function. More troubling were the psychological effects of their confinement. Several members appeared to have lost the ability to make independent decisions, looking to designated leaders for permission before speaking, eating, or even moving from one location to another. Dr. Whitfield's medical report notes, ORT. Patients exhibit symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological manipulation and isolation trauma. Many appear to have developed a childlike dependency, requiring constant direction and reassurance from authority figures. Recovery will require extensive medical and psychological intervention. The investigation into Blackthorne's background, conducted over the following months, revealed a pattern of similar activities in other states. Records eventually obtained from authorities in Arkansas and Kansas showed that individuals matching Blackthorne's description had established religious communities in those states between 1928 and 1932, invariably gaining control over the assets of followers before disappearing under suspicious circumstances. In Arkansas, a man calling himself Reverend Malachi Thornfield had established what he termed the Brotherhood of Divine Submission near the town of Mountain View in 1929. According to records maintained by the Stone County Sheriff's Office in Arkansas, this congregation had attracted approximately 30 adults before Thornfield vanished in late 1931, taking with him deeds to several properties and an estimated $20,000 in cash and valuables. Several former members of that congregation had been found in a condition similar to that of Blackthorne's followers, requiring months of medical care and psychological rehabilitation. The Arkansas investigation had been hampered by the same challenges that initially confronted authorities in Missouri. The religious nature of the community had made law enforcement reluctant to intervene, and by the time serious concerns were raised, the leader had already disappeared with most of the community's assets. Several former members had been too traumatized to provide coherent testimony, and others seemed to have simply vanished entirely. Similar patterns emerged from Kansas, where records from the Bourbon County authorities documented the activities of a Pastor Ezra Blackwood, who had operated a religious commune near the town of Fort Scott in 1928. Again, followers had surrendered property and assets to the church, and several individuals had disappeared entirely before local authorities intervened. The Kansas case had involved a community of approximately 25 adults who had been attracted to Blackwood's promises of spiritual fulfillment and economic prosperity. Like his later incarnations, Blackwood had initially provided genuine assistance to his followers, helping them resolve financial problems and offering what appeared to be sincere spiritual guidance. However, over time, he had systematically isolated them from their families and communities while gaining control over their assets. The federal investigation that followed these discoveries would eventually document what authorities described as one of the most sophisticated religious fraud schemes in American history. FBI agent Cornelius Vance, who led the federal investigation, described Blackthorne's operation in his report to the Bureau. Subject appears to have developed and refined a systematic approach to psychological manipulation that exploits religious faith for financial gain. His methods demonstrate careful study of human psychology and social dynamics, allowing him to identify and target vulnerable individuals within isolated communities. Agent Vance's investigation revealed that Blackthorne had systematically studied the economic and social conditions of rural communities throughout the Midwest, identifying areas where economic hardship and social isolation created populations susceptible to his particular form of manipulation. His choice of Stone County, Missouri, appears to have been deliberate, taking advantage of the area's geographic isolation and the economic desperation created by the ongoing depression. The federal investigation also uncovered evidence that Blackthorne had received assistance from a network of associates who helped him identify potential targets and establish new operations. These associates, operating under various aliases, would travel through rural areas posing as traveling salesmen, surveyors, or other legitimate businessmen while gathering intelligence about local economic conditions and identifying communities that might be vulnerable to Blackthorne's methods. The trial of Silas Blackthorne began in the federal courthouse in Springfield, Missouri, on November 5, 1934. The proceedings attracted national attention, with newspapers across the country sending reporters to cover what the St. Louis Post-Dispatch described as a case that exposes the dangerous potential of religious manipulation in rural America. The prosecution, led by federal prosecutor Mordecai Whitmore, faced the challenge of proving criminal intent in activities that had been disguised as religious practice. The testimony of former congregation members provided the most compelling evidence against Blackthorne. One by one, survivors described the gradual process by which they had been separated from their normal lives and drawn into complete dependence on Blackthorne's authority. Ezekiel Mordaunt, who had been among the members found at the hidden compound, testified about the systematic isolation and psychological pressure that had led him to surrender his farm. According to court transcripts, Mordaunt's testimony revealed the sophisticated nature of Blackthorne's manipulation. At first, Pastor Blackthorne seemed to offer exactly what I needed after my wife's death. I was struggling with grief and financial difficulties, and he provided both spiritual guidance and practical assistance that actually improved my situation. But gradually, he began requiring more of my time, more of my resources, more of my unquestioning obedience. Mordaunt described how Blackthorne had gradually isolated him from his neighbors and remaining family members, claiming that outside influences would interfere with his spiritual development. Church members were discouraged from reading newspapers, listening to radio broadcasts, or maintaining correspondence with non-members. Over time, Blackthorne became their sole source of information about the outside world, allowing him to control their perception of reality. The psychological manipulation became more intensive as members became more dependent. Blackthorne introduced what he called purification rituals that involved fasting, sleep deprivation, and prolonged periods of meditation that resembled self-hypnosis. Members who questioned these practices were subjected to public criticism and social isolation within the group, creating powerful pressure to conform. Dr. Whitfield's expert testimony provided medical context for the physical and psychological condition in which the congregation members had been found. His examination of the survivors revealed evidence of systematic malnutrition, chronic stress, and what he described as induced dependency syndrome, a psychological condition in which adults lose the ability to function independently after prolonged subjection to authoritarian control. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of Jeremiah Ashford, the church member whose collapse had initiated the investigation. Ashford described in detail the disciplined sessions that Blackthorne conducted for members who showed signs of independence or resistance. These sessions, held in the basement of the church, involved psychological pressure techniques designed to break down individual will and create complete submission to Blackthorne's authority. According to Ashford's testimony, members selected for discipline were subjected to prolonged isolation, restricted food and water, and constant verbal pressure to confess their spiritual failings and pledge renewed obedience. Those who continued to resist were transferred to the hidden compound, where conditions were designed to completely break their psychological resistance. The defense, led by attorney Nehemiah Fleming, attempted to portray Blackthorne as a sincere religious leader whose methods, while unconventional, were protected by constitutional guarantees of religious freedom. Fleming argued that the congregation members had voluntarily chosen to follow Blackthorne's teachings and that their surrender of property was a legitimate expression of religious commitment. However, the defense strategy was undermined by evidence of deliberate deception and fraud in Blackthorne's activities. Prosecutor Whitmore presented evidence that Blackthorne had used multiple false identities, concealed his criminal history, and systematically misrepresented his credentials and authority. Property records showed that while members believed they were donating assets to their church, legal ownership had been transferred to Blackthorne personally, rather than to any recognized religious organization. Most damaging to the defense was evidence that Blackthorne had planned his escape from Stone County, just as he had apparently done in Arkansas and Kansas. Investigators found hidden caches of cash and valuables on the church property, along with false identification documents and travel plans that suggested Blackthorne intended to disappear once he had extracted maximum value from his Missouri operation. The prosecution also presented evidence of the physical harm that had resulted from Blackthorne's methods. Several congregation members required extended medical treatment for malnutrition and related health problems. The psychological damage was even more severe, with some survivors showing little improvement even after months of medical care and counseling. The federal jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against Blackthorne, including mail fraud, interstate transportation of stolen property, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The convictions carried a maximum sentence of 30 years in federal prison, but the judge's sentencing statement suggested that Blackthorne's crimes represented something more serious than simple financial fraud. Judge Cornelius Matthews, in his sentencing remarks delivered on December 15, 1934, described Blackthorne's operation as a systematic assault on human dignity and psychological autonomy that transcends mere theft of property to constitute a form of spiritual destruction. The judge sentenced Blackthorne to the maximum term available under federal law, noting that the psychological damage inflicted on his victims might never be fully repaired. The case attracted additional attention when several survivors filed civil lawsuits seeking recovery of their lost property and compensation for their suffering. However, most of the assets that had been transferred to Blackthorne had already been converted to cash or hidden, making recovery difficult. The church property itself was sold to satisfy outstanding debts, but the proceeds were insufficient to compensate all the individuals who had lost their homes and farms. The aftermath of the Blackthorne case had lasting effects on both the survivors and the broader community of Stone County. Several individuals never recovered financially from their losses, forced to start over with no assets and limited prospects in the midst of the continuing economic depression. The psychological effects proved even more persistent, with some survivors requiring years of medical treatment and never fully regaining their independence and confidence. Ezekiel Mordaunt, who had lost his farm to Blackthorne's scheme, never regained financial stability. He worked as a day laborer for the remainder of his life, living in a small rented cabin near Galena and rarely speaking publicly about his experiences with the sanctuary. According to family members interviewed years later, Mordaunt suffered from what they described as melancholy spells that required periodic medical attention throughout the 1940s and 1950s. Matthias Thornfield faced similar challenges in rebuilding his life after the ordeal. His sawmill had been sold to satisfy debts, and he was forced to find employment as a laborer in other people's operations. He never remarried and became increasingly reclusive as he aged, avoiding social gatherings and rarely participating in community activities. The Sanctuary of Eternal Peace building itself was eventually demolished in 1938, after standing empty for 4 years. Local residents reportedly found the structure disturbing, and several attempts to use it for other purposes failed when occupants complained of an atmosphere that made normal activities difficult. The underground chambers that Blackthorne had constructed were filled with concrete before the building was raised. The case also had broader implications for how authorities approached similar situations involving religious communities and charismatic leaders. The investigation techniques developed by Detective Morrison and FBI agent Vance became models for future cases involving religious fraud and systematic psychological manipulation. Law enforcement agencies throughout the Midwest circulated information about Blackthorne's methods to help identify similar operations in their jurisdictions. Dr. Whitfield's medical documentation of the psychological effects of Blackthorne's manipulation contributed to early research into what would later be recognized as systematic psychological abuse. His detailed case studies of the survivors provided valuable insights into the processes by which normal adults could be gradually conditioned to surrender their independence and critical thinking abilities. In 1943, 9 years into his federal sentence, Blackthorne died in prison of what officials described as complications from tuberculosis. His death received little attention outside of Stone County, where some residents viewed it as the final chapter in a dark period they preferred to forget. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the federal prison cemetery, with no known associates or supporters attending the service. The survivors of Blackthorne's congregation faced varying degrees of success in rebuilding their lives after their ordeal. Some individuals managed to reestablish themselves financially and psychologically, eventually becoming advocates for other victims of religious fraud. Others never fully recovered from their losses, struggling with poverty and psychological problems that persisted for decades. As of the present day, the site where the Sanctuary of Eternal Peace once stood remains undeveloped forest land within the Mark Twain National Forest. Hikers occasionally pass through the area without realizing its historical significance, as no markers indicate the events that occurred there decades earlier. The underground chambers that once housed Blackthorne's victims have been sealed and overgrown, leaving few physical traces of the tragedy that unfolded in this remote corner of Missouri. The silence that has surrounded the case in Stone County reflects not just shame or embarrassment, but a deeper discomfort with confronting the implications of what occurred. To fully acknowledge the reality of Blackthorne's manipulation would require accepting that the qualities we value most highly in ourselves and others, faith, loyalty, generosity, and trust, can also make us vulnerable to those who would exploit them for their own purposes. The legacy of the Sanctuary of Eternal Peace serves as a reminder that the capacity for both good and evil lies within human nature, and that the same social and psychological mechanisms that enable communities, families, and religious congregations to flourish can also be turned to destructive purposes by those who understand how to manipulate them. The victims of Silas Blackthorne learned this lesson at great cost, losing not only their material possessions, but also their sense of agency and self-worth. Their suffering stands as a testament to both the vulnerability and the resilience of the human spirit, as many of them eventually managed to rebuild their lives and find meaning in their survival. The story of what happened at the Sanctuary of Eternal Peace remains buried in the hills of Stone County, but its echoes continue to resonate wherever people gather in search of meaning, community, and spiritual guidance. The macabre church that horrified a nation may be gone, but the human vulnerabilities it exploited and the lessons it taught about the dark potential of human manipulation remain with us still